In the southern reaches of Morocco, where the land releases its last trace of vegetation, the Sahara begins without announcement. There is no clear boundary. The ground simply dries, flattens, and stretches until distance loses meaning. The horizon becomes a fixed line. Movement feels small against it. The Sahara Desert covers more than 9 million square kilometers across North Africa. It is the largest hot desert on Earth. In some regions, sand forms high dunes shaped by wind. In others, the terrain is stone, gravel, and exposed bedrock. Temperatures in spring can exceed 45 degrees Celsius during the day and fall sharply at night. Shade is rare. Water is not visible unless one knows exactly where to look. Each year, a section of this desert hosts one of the most demanding endurance races in the world. The Marathon des Sables crosses remote terrain over several stages, typically covering around 250 kilometers in 6 days. Competitors carry their own food and equipment. The landscape does not change for them. It does not adjust. In April 1994, runners gathered again in southern Morocco for the event. They stood in open ground, facing an environment that offered no protection and no guidance beyond marked checkpoints. The desert was quiet that morning. Wind moved lightly across the surface of the sand. There was no indication that within days, one competitor would become separated from the race entirely. Among the competitors in April 1994 was Mauro Prosperi, an Italian police officer from Sicily. He was 39 years old at the time. By profession, he served as a member of Italy's Carabinieri. Outside of work, he trained as an endurance athlete. He had experience in long-distance running and had competed in demanding events before entering the Sahara. Prosperi was not a professional desert specialist. He was an amateur endurance competitor with a structured training background. He prepared for the Marathon des Sables with distance running, conditioning, and logistical planning. Like other participants, he understood that the race required self-sufficiency. Each runner carried a pack containing food rations, basic medical supplies, a sleeping bag, a signaling mirror, and a limited water allowance distributed at checkpoints. The Marathon des Sables, founded in 1986, had developed a reputation as one of the most difficult foot races in the world. The course changed slightly each year, but the structure remained consistent. Multiple stages across open desert, including dunes and rocky plains. Competitors navigated between marked points using visible course indicators. Medical staff and race officials monitored progress, but between checkpoints, runners were largely alone. In 1994, the race began under typical spring conditions. Daytime heat was severe but expected. Winds were present but not unusual. Participants moved in staggered lines across the landscape, spaced apart by pace and endurance level. Prosperi maintained steady progress during the early stages. There was no indication that he was struggling beyond the normal strain of the event. The environment of southern Morocco during that season can shift quickly. In open desert, wind can intensify without warning. Sandstorms, known locally as sirocco's or chirgui winds, can reduce visibility to almost nothing. Course markers become difficult to see. Orientation depends heavily on line-of-sight navigation. When that visibility disappears, runners must decide whether to stop or continue moving. Prosperi was accustomed to endurance discomfort. He had trained to manage fatigue and dehydration within limits. He had not, however, experienced prolonged exposure to a Saharan sandstorm while alone between checkpoints. No competitor expects to become permanently separated from a marked route. The race organization relied on visibility and tracking methods common at the time. GPS tracking devices were not standard in 1994. Monitoring depended largely on manual checkpoint counts. On the day that would alter the course of his participation, Prosperi began another stage like the others. The sky was clear in the morning. The sand reflected early sunlight. Runners moved at their own pace. Some were visible in the distance ahead. Others followed behind. By midday, wind speed increased. Sand began to lift from the ground in small waves. The horizon blurred. What had been a visible route between markers started to dissolve into movement. Race officials had protocols advising runners to stop if visibility dropped severely. But in open desert, the decision to halt can also carry risk. Standing still means prolonged exposure to blowing sand and heat. Continuing forward carries the risk of drift. Prosperi chose to keep moving. At first, he believed the storm would pass quickly. He wrapped cloth around his face and lowered his head against the wind. He continued in the direction he believed the course followed. Other runners disappeared from view. The ground beneath him remained the same in texture and color. There were no landmarks. Within hours, the markers were no longer visible. The race continued elsewhere across the desert. Officials recorded arrivals at checkpoints. Names were checked and noted. Prosperi's absence was not immediately clear. The storm did not end that day. By late afternoon, the wind had intensified beyond routine desert conditions. Sand lifted in sustained sheets from the surface, moving horizontally across the terrain. Visibility narrowed to a few meters. The sky lost definition. The sun became a diffused brightness behind airborne dust. Mauro Prosperi could no longer see other competitors. He could not see the next course marker. The ground offered no variation to confirm direction. In desert racing, runners typically orient themselves by the position of distant flags or reflective indicators. In the storm, those reference points vanished. Prosperi later stated that he believed he was maintaining a straight path. He attempted to shield his eyes and mouth while continuing forward. Stopping would have required remaining stationary in an exposed area with no shelter. He chose movement over stillness. Hours passed. The storm did not subside. When visibility briefly improved, there were no markers in sight. No footprints remained. Wind had erased them. The desert surface appeared undisturbed in every direction. At that point, Prosperi understood he was no longer on the marked route. Race officials eventually initiated search efforts once his absence became evident at subsequent checkpoints. However, the scale of the Sahara complicates any search operation. A deviation of only a few degrees over several hours can translate into dozens of kilometers of separation. Wind can further distort estimated paths. Prosperi carried limited supplies intended for a single stage of the race. His food rations were calculated for controlled progress between checkpoints. His water allowance was regulated. There was no additional reserve for extended isolation. As evening approached, temperatures began to drop. The storm continued into the night. Prosperi remained alone in open terrain, without confirmed orientation and without visible course indicators. The point of no return had passed quietly. There had been no dramatic moment, only a gradual loss of reference. By nightfall, he was no longer a competitor in a race. He was an individual moving untracked through one of the largest deserts in the world. When the storm weakened the following day, Mauro Prosperi surveyed his surroundings. The landscape offered no identifiable markers. There were no race flags, no vehicle tracks, and no visible human presence. The terrain consisted of open sand and scattered rock formations. He estimated that he had drifted far from the official route, though he did not know in which direction. He carried the standard race pack issued for that stage: limited water, dehydrated food rations, a sleeping bag, a small knife, flares, and a signaling mirror. These supplies had been intended to last until the next checkpoint. Now, they represented his only resources. Prosperi began walking. He selected a direction based on his memory of the course layout, attempting to move generally eastward. Without instruments capable of precise navigation, he relied on the sun's position during the day. At night, he attempted to maintain orientation using the stars, though shifting winds and exhaustion made straight travel difficult. The Sahara's surface is deceptive. Dunes alter shape, and flat expanses provide no visual feedback to confirm distance traveled. During the early days of his isolation, he rationed his remaining water carefully. He reduced his pace to conserve energy. Daytime temperatures rose sharply. Heat radiated from the sand. Sweat evaporated almost immediately, masking fluid loss. He limited movement during peak afternoon hours and resumed walking when temperatures dropped slightly. Food supplies diminished quickly. The race required competitors to carry minimal calories to reduce pack weight. Prosperi consumed what remained over the first few days, dividing portions into small increments. Hunger became constant but secondary to thirst. On the fourth day, he encountered a small white structure, partially embedded in sand. It was a marabout, a simple Islamic shrine, commonly found in parts of North Africa. These structures are often built over the graves of religious figures. The interior offered shade and limited protection from wind. Prosperi entered the shrine and remained there temporarily. Inside, he found bats roosting in the ceiling. He later reported killing several of them with his knife. The bats provided a small source of protein and moisture. He cooked them using a small fire constructed from sparse materials available near the structure. The caloric value was minimal, but extended his capacity to continue moving. Water remained the central concern. Once his supply was exhausted, he began collecting his own urine in a container and consuming small amounts to delay dehydration. Medical authorities later noted that this practice offers limited benefit and can accelerate complications when prolonged. At the time, it was a decision made under extreme scarcity. Prosperi stayed near the shrine long enough to regain partial strength. He inscribed his name on the interior wall, along with a note indicating the date. He believed there was a possibility that he might die there and wanted to leave a record of his presence. The act was practical rather than ceremonial. After several days, he resumed walking. He had concluded that remaining stationary would not increase his chance of discovery. The race search teams were operating closer to the established route. Prosperi believed he had traveled too far from it to be located by organized search efforts. Physical deterioration became more pronounced. His lips cracked from dehydration. His skin burned and peeled under constant sun exposure. Weight loss accelerated as caloric intake dropped to near zero. Movement slowed, but he continued. During one phase of his walk, Prosperi encountered a colony of beetles. He consumed some of them raw. Insects provided marginal nutrition but required no fire or preparation. Survival in arid environments often depends on opportunistic intake rather than sustained meals. Navigation remained uncertain. Prosperi later estimated that he traveled generally southeast, eventually crossing from Morocco into Algeria. The exact path cannot be reconstructed precisely. Without GPS data from that period, calculations rely on his recollections and the location where he was ultimately found. As days passed, cognitive clarity diminished. Dehydration affects concentration and judgment. He continued to orient himself by the sun during daylight hours, attempting to avoid circular movement. The desert surface offered no confirmation of progress. Distance is difficult to judge when the horizon remains unchanged. Night temperatures dropped sharply. Prosperi used his sleeping bag to retain heat. Rest was fragmented. Wind often returned in lighter waves, carrying sand that settled over his clothing and equipment. Each morning required brushing away accumulated grit before resuming travel. By the seventh day, his physical condition had declined severely. His weight had dropped significantly. Muscle strength weakened. He experienced periods of dizziness. Despite this, he maintained a pattern. Walk during tolerable temperatures, rest during extremes, consume any available organic matter encountered, and conserve energy whenever possible. The psychological dimension of prolonged isolation in desert conditions is difficult to measure. Prosperi later described maintaining focus on immediate tasks rather than distant outcomes. He concentrated on the mechanics of walking, on identifying minor terrain variations that might indicate direction, and on preserving the small tools he still possessed. There is no verified record of hallucinations during this period, though dehydration at that level can produce perceptual disturbances. What is documented is his continued forward movement. On the eighth day, he believed he was approaching a different type of terrain. The sand thinned, replaced gradually by rocky ground. Such transitions can indicate proximity to broader geographic boundaries. He continued toward that variation. By this point, his body mass had decreased dramatically. Medical reports after rescue indicated he had lost approximately 15 to 18 kilograms. His kidneys were under significant strain. Blood pressure was unstable, yet he remained mobile. The ninth day began without visible change in the landscape. Prosperi continued walking under direct sun exposure. His clothing was worn and coated in sand. Supplies were exhausted. He no longer had food. Water intake was minimal and inconsistent. In the late hours of that day, he saw figures in the distance. At first, he could not determine whether they were real or a distortion caused by heat shimmer. As he approached, the shapes resolved into human silhouettes accompanied by animals. They were Tuareg nomads traveling through the region. Prosperi had crossed into Algerian territory. The systematic phase of his survival, structured by routine, rationing, and forward motion, had lasted 9 days. He had covered an estimated distance of more than 250 kilometers, though exact measurement remains uncertain. He had survived primarily through movement, limited shelter, and improvised nutrition. When he reached the nomads, he no longer had the physical capacity to continue independently. By the time Mauro Prosperi approached the Tuareg nomads, his condition had reached critical limits. His body weight had dropped significantly. His lips were split from dehydration. His tongue was swollen. His vision was unstable in bright light. Movement had become mechanical rather than controlled. In the days prior to that encounter, his physical and psychological condition had both deteriorated. During one period of extreme exhaustion inside the Marabout shrine, Prosperi concluded that he might not survive. Believing death to be imminent, he attempted to cut his wrists with his knife. Due to severe dehydration, his blood had thickened, and the wounds did not bleed as expected. The attempt did not result in fatal injury. He later stated that the failure of the act forced him to continue. There is no detailed medical record of the wounds beyond acknowledgement that they were superficial and not life-threatening. After that moment, he resumed movement. As his strength declined, walking required deliberate pacing. He shortened his stride and limited exertion during peak heat. He no longer had measurable water reserves. Urine production had nearly ceased, a clinical sign of advanced dehydration. His kidneys were under stress. His heart rate fluctuated irregularly with exertion. The desert environment during this phase did not change. The terrain remained exposed. Shade was rare. Wind patterns were intermittent but less severe than the original storm. What intensified was the internal strain. Hunger had faded into background sensation. Thirst dominated awareness. When he saw the figures ahead on the 9th day, he did not accelerate. Rapid movement could have caused collapse. Instead, he continued at the same reduced pace until the individuals became clearly identifiable as nomadic travelers. The Tuareg group was moving with camels across the region near the Algerian border. Prosperi reached them in a weakened state. Communication was limited by language barriers and his physical exhaustion. The nomads provided water gradually to prevent shock. Rapid rehydration after severe dehydration can cause complications. Careful intake was necessary. At this stage, Prosperi had been missing from the Marathon des Sables for more than a week. Race organizers had conducted search operations, but the scale of his deviation made location difficult. His crossing into Algeria placed him outside the immediate search perimeter. The escalation of his condition had culminated not in dramatic collapse but in progressive shutdown. Organ systems were strained, muscular strength was reduced, cognitive function was slowed but intact enough to seek assistance. He had traveled beyond the area where he had been expected to survive. The Tuareg nomads transported Mauro Prosperi to a nearby Algerian settlement. From there, local authorities arranged medical evaluation. He was admitted to a hospital in Algeria after confirmation of his identity and circumstances. Medical staff documented severe dehydration, significant weight loss, electrolyte imbalance, and acute kidney stress. His body mass had decreased by approximately 15 to 18 kilograms during the 9-day ordeal. His skin showed extensive sun damage and cracking. His lips and oral tissues were injured from prolonged dryness. Despite these conditions, he remained conscious and responsive. Rehydration was administered carefully through controlled fluid intake. Sudden overconsumption of water after extreme dehydration can lead to complications, including cardiovascular instability. Physicians stabilized his electrolyte levels gradually. Kidney function was monitored closely in the first days following admission. Meanwhile, news of his survival reached race officials and Italian authorities. The Marathon des Sables organization had continued search efforts during his disappearance, though search radius estimates had not extended as far as the Algerian border. His discovery clarified the distance he had traveled from the intended route. After initial treatment in Algeria, Prosperi was transferred to Italy for continued recovery. His survival was officially confirmed. There was no public celebration at the hospital. Recovery required time. Muscle mass had to be rebuilt. Organ function had to stabilize. In clinical terms, he had survived acute dehydration and prolonged exposure in a hyper-arid environment without structured support. His case drew attention within endurance sport communities and survival research discussions, primarily because of the distance covered and the duration of isolation. The desert had not changed during those 9 days. It remained what it had always been. What changed was the confirmation that one individual had crossed it unintentionally and remained alive. Mauro Prosperi's disappearance during the 1994 Marathon des Sables became one of the most documented survival incidents in endurance racing history. His unplanned crossing from Morocco into Algeria demonstrated how quickly orientation can dissolve in large desert systems. A deviation measured in hours became a journey measured in days. In the months following his recovery, Prosperi returned gradually to physical training. Medical supervision confirmed that his kidney function stabilized. Weight was regained. Scarring from sun exposure and minor injuries remained, but no permanent organ failure was reported. In later years, he participated again in endurance competitions, including subsequent editions of the Marathon des Sables. His survival did not alter the desert. The Sahara continued to host the race each year under revised safety measures and improved tracking technologies. GPS monitoring later became standard practice in extreme endurance events, reducing the likelihood of similar disappearances. The significance of the event lies not in spectacle but in scale. A single runner moved beyond a marked route and entered an environment indifferent to intention. There were no dramatic confrontations, only heat, distance, and time. When Prosperi left the hospital, the desert remained where it had always been: expansive, quiet, and unchanged. The record of those 9 days exists because he continued walking.